we're finally ready for some actual mathematical theorems that have to do with social choice theory and voting theory. The first that we're going to take a look at, I consider a really good theorem. It helps us feel good about the choices we've made, maybe as a country, and about some of the voting systems that we've been studying, and that's May's theorem. And what it says is that when you have an election where there are only two possible choices, or two candidates, the only voting method that preserves anonymity, neutrality, is nearly decisive, meaning we always decide except in the case of an absolute dead tie, and one that is monotonous is the majority rules method. And remember that monotonous criteria has to do with a candidate gaining first place support. They can't lose after they've done that. The only voting method that satisfies all of those things simultaneously is the majority rules method. The method of whoever has more than 50% of the votes is the winner is the method that's going to be fair. Now, why do I say that maybe this helps us feel better about things? Well, first of all, in the United States currently, we often vote in two-party elections and we use the majority rules method, so that should help us feel a little bit better. But I also think that it helps us understand some of these other voting systems. When we started having more than two candidates in elections, a lot of the different methods that we've studied really focused on trying to get to a point where we had an election between two candidates and the majority wins somehow. So you can definitely see that in a plurality with runoff, with instant runoff, with Copeland's method. Even when you're talking about sequential voting, you're pairing candidates up and having them face off in head-to-head elections where we're using majority rules. So I think it helps us to see that even though we've found a couple of strange things that can happen with various voting systems, what I hope rings true about May's theorem is that we haven't done any of these voting methods trying to create chaos. We've been trying to show some preservation of the fairness of the majority rules criteria. On the other hand, we've got what I would call the bad, and I don't mean that the theorem is bad, but it's a fact about life that is pretty hard, and this theorem is called Arrow's Impossibility Theorem. One of the things that's really interesting about this theorem is it was proven by Kenneth Arrow in 1951. He is actually still alive. He's in his 90s now, but Kenneth Arrow won the Nobel Prize for this work, and he's shown right down here receiving his Nobel Prize in economics. And Arrow's Impossibility Theorem states, suppose we have a voting system. We're no longer making the assumption that we have a two-candidate or a two-party election here. If we have a voting system that is decisive, meaning it's going to totally order our candidates from first through last, and we're not going to have any ties. If that voting method is deterministic, and what that means is that really and truly it's only the voter preferences that influence the outcome of the election, there is no randomness involved, that's kind of reminiscent of our nearly decisive criteria. If we were in the situation with two voters in a dead tie and we were forced to determine an outcome, a lot of people would flip a coin. And that sort of thing is not allowed because we don't want any amount of randomness involved in determining our elections. If our voting system follows the Pareto condition, where if every single person prefers candidate A to candidate B, then it is impossible for candidate B to win. And if our voting system follows the independence of irrelevant alternatives, or the IIA, then this voting system is a dictatorship. The only thing that's going to satisfy all of those criteria, and it's only 4 criteria, is a dictatorship. And that was the theorem proven by Kenneth Arrow in 1951. If we take the contrapositive of Arrow's theorem, and we suppose that we're looking at a voting system that is not a dictatorship, like any of the voting systems that we've looked at so far, then what we can conclude is that it is not the case that all 4 of these things hold. So it is not the case that all 4 of these things hold. That means we're going to fail at least once. We're going to have a voting system that fails to be decisive. We're going to have a voting system that fails to determine the outcomes based on voter preference alone. It might fail to follow the Pareto condition, or it might fail to follow the IIA. It's going to need to fail in at least one of these categories. It could fail in many of them. Or in other words, if we have a voting system that is not a dictatorship, it is forced to be fundamentally flawed somehow. That's the ugly truth of what we know to be a proven fact. And one thing that's particularly ugly about this fact is that when people start getting into voting theory and talking about, well, I like this voting method, and somebody else says, well, I like this other voting method, and we start to argue about which voting method is better, that's a thing that we can do, but we'll never be able to prove to somebody in some ways that our voting system is the best voting system, because it's always guaranteed to have some type of flaw. And what's particularly ugly about this is that it can lead a lot of people to argue about different voting methods and which one ought to be used. However, we absolutely cannot end on the sad note that comes from Arrow's Impossibility Theorem. Arrow's Impossibility Theorem is a truth fact, and it's one that we need to deal with, but it doesn't mean that the world is hopeless. So we need to think about that. When we say that our voting system is going to be fundamentally flawed, what we really mean is that our voting system is going to violate at least one of these things, maybe other types of fairness conditions. We didn't even list them all in Arrow's Impossibility Theorem, but maybe there are some voting systems that are flawed in only one way, while there are other voting systems that are flawed in several ways. So just because we know that every voting system is guaranteed to have a flaw, that doesn't mean that they're all equally bad. I sometimes emphasize this by saying, think about if you're putting toppings on a pizza and you don't get the toppings you prefer. Is the bad topping that you have some mushrooms on there and you're going to have to pick them off? Or is the bad topping that your pizza is covered in oil and glass? Which of those situations would you prefer? They're both not what you wanted, but that doesn't mean that they're equally bad. So think about that with voting systems too. Just because a voting system is flawed doesn't mean it's just as bad as another voting system. And in fact, plurality voting is really one of the most fundamentally flawed. So there's this meme over here that the United States uses plurality voting, and we kind of dig our own graves sometimes with our strict adherence to plurality voting and our absolute refusal to hear anything about any other voting system because we know that the rest of them have flaws too. They don't have as bad a flaws as the one we've got, but we insist upon sticking with a very flawed voting system. Another thing we can do, as we have seen in our class, is we can advocate for larger voter turnout with people who are going to vote honestly according to their desires. The bigger and better representation we have, the more data we have in order to determine our social choice, the better job our social choice can do. And we've seen by example, both in history and in person, that when you have a large voting populace that votes according to their best interests, you often get strong results that would have been determined the same no matter what voting system you used. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. We always want to have more information and more data points when we make a decision. Most people who truly study social choice theory really like methods like Copeland's method when we look for a Condorcet victor. So if you can find a voting system that would elect a Condorcet candidate whenever one exists, then this is a really strong condition to be able to guarantee with your voting system. It's a very good measure of fairness. Now, what's unfortunate about this last event is that a Condorcet victor often does not exist, and Copeland's method is very indecisive. It often creates a lot of ties because it can't tell who ought to win. That's one thing that's true about Copeland's method. But if you can find a voting system that's guaranteed to elect a Condorcet candidate when one exists, then this is a good voting system. And last but not least is to consider approval voting, another style of voting that's very highly supported by experts.
Now, what approval voting is a failure to rank all of the candidates. You do not select your first choice, your second choice, your third choice, etc., but rather you just select as many candidates as you'd like of which you approve. So you have the ability to say, I approve of this candidate and I do not approve of this candidate, but you do not say of the candidates that you approve of, which you prefer to the other. And because of this, approval voting is very easy to explain to others, and it technically escapes classification via Arrow's Impossibility Theorem. Arrow's Impossibility Theorem assumes that you have used a ranked choice voting method in order to determine your winner. So approval voting has a lot of support from people who truly study social choice theory, and it's been very advocated for. It does have flaws. We won't study them in great detail, but it is possible to manipulate this system because the spirit of Arrow's Impossibility Theorem lives on. In general, it's very difficult to make social choices, and there are some concessions you're going to have to make. But approval voting has been studied to be less subject to manipulation. It's considered very fair by people who study this professionally, and because of its simplicity, can be a really great method to advocate for. So there we have it. We've had the good, we've had the bad, we've had the ugly, and hopefully we have some actions we can take moving forward to help us make better social choices.